What I hope by the end of the presentation today is that you'll have a good understanding of the complexity of this thing we call trust, but more importantly that you'll see what's possible for promoting trust and even more importantly your own trustworthiness in the healthcare system. You should have received the list of learning objectives for this module, but in summary what I want to do is first set the context. And look at an example of racial differences in genetic testing and raise some questions of what that has to do with trust and trustworthiness, and to spend the bulk of the time actually defining these concepts. Defining them, exploring them, in some ways deconstructing them. But whenever you deconstruct something, it's best that you then reconstruct it. So that's the last thing what we're going to do, is talk about translating some of these abstract ideas into what you can actually do in the healthcare system to promote trust and, as I said, more importantly, your own trustworthiness. So let's begin. This was an article that showed up in JAMA in April of this year, titled Racial Differences in the Use of BRCA1 and 2 Testing Among Women with a Family History of Breast or Ovarian Cancer. What they wanted to do was to test their suspicions that there's racial disparities in the use of genetic susceptibility testing, and to look at the relationship between race and the use of BRCA1 and 2 counseling or genetic testing among a particular group of women. These were women with a positive family history of breast cancer.
Can we ask you to just move to the right by about 2 feet?
Ah, okay. All right, let's do this. Yeah.
Perfect.
And they also wanted to look at the contribution of SES, socioeconomic status, cancer risk perception, attitudes that these particular women may have had about genetic testing, and particular interactions with their primary care physicians. And these were limited in this study to whether or not the physicians actually suggested that they go. So this wasn't deep about anything about doctor-patient relationship. It was a case-control study. They had 408 women, all with, as I mentioned, with a positive family history of breast or ovarian cancer. And they were divided into cases, that is, those who did go and receive genetic counseling and testing, and then those used as controls for those who did not go for that. Again, they wanted to look at whether or not there was some probability, whether there's actually a risk of having this mutation. They wanted to look at socioeconomic characteristics, cancer risk perception, and actually this slide just sort of summarizes it better. Again, they wanted to look at this relationship. Is there a relationship between a woman's race and whether she goes for counseling or genetic testing? And if it's so, what could explain that relationship? Could it be explained by socioeconomic status, their own perception of their risk of cancer, whether they were worried about it, what their general attitudes were about genetic testing, and then again the doctor-patient relationship limited to whether or not the doctor communicated that there was a need for testing or not. The results were that they found that African American women with a family history of breast ovarian cancer were much less likely to go for genetic counseling or testing than the white women in the sample. And again, these were, even though they all had family history of these cancers. And this particular disparity was not explained by any of those factors. In other words, they ruled out that any of these factors had anything to do with it. Did logistic regression and various other analyses for that. So what did they say could account for it? And that quote from the discussion section of this paper: other factors must contribute to this disparity. Healthcare-related distrust has been demonstrated to be higher among African Americans than whites and may serve as a barrier to medical care. New technologies such as genetic testing may be particularly sensitive to the effects of distrust. Now, the question I'd like for you to hold throughout the next part of this presentation, and we'll come back to it, is this is their conclusion. Is it a fair one? So that is setting the context. Let's now look at this thing that they said was responsible for, or possibly responsible for the results that they found, this thing called trust. I really like this quote from philosopher Annette Bayer, who says that trust is the phenomena we're so familiar with that we scarcely notice its presence and variety. The talk is going to emphasize a lot of this idea of its variety. But before I move any further, I want to just give you a little thought experiment, just for a moment. Just think about this. Imagine someone, and let's just be specific and say someone in an authority position in your life, in your history, your life history, or even currently now. Think of someone in that position who you trust. Just come up with that person in your mind. And then for a minute, think about, well, what is it about that phenomena of trust for that person? How would you characterize it? What is it about that trust? Could you name it more particularly than just, yes, I trust that person? So just think about that for a moment. Now, if we had more time, I'd ask you to do the same thought experiment with someone who you don't trust. But at your leisure, you could think about that too. And in retrospect, after today's presentation, it might be very illustrative for you. But it's, as Annette says, it's a phenomena that we scarcely notice its presence and variety. And that speaks to it being what's called a latent construct, something that exists, but you can't pick it up. You can't quite measure it. And if we'd had a large audience here and I had each of you come and tell me what that quality of trust for that person you thought about, we'd probably have a range of ideas. This is the variety that Bayer is talking about. And if we were psychologists and we were doing some sort of social psychology experiment, we could name those and then run factor analysis on them and see how these different these different items, these different factors about trust would load around various ideas. So that's, and I'm going to do a shortcut for that and just talk about it linguistically. That is, if we were to define trust simply as a linguistic question, we could come up with at least 3 different semantic meanings of the word. And this is what's really important about this, that each meaning could suggest a particular course of action if you wanted to promote trust or trustworthiness. So let's take a look at this. I like this particular way of thinking about it, which I adapted from David Cooper, a linguist who wrote an article in the Journal of Medical Ethics in 1985. And as a linguist, he identified 3 different qualities to think about. One is this idea of entrusting, and I'm going to go through each of these in more detail. Another is this idea of competence. And thirdly, one that's about caring and altruism. So taking each one, this idea of entrusting. So you imagine that you are a medical provider, or even better, imagine that you are a health consumer, and you have a serious health concern, and you take yourself to the healthcare system, to a particular provider, and they put you in a room, and they give you one of those nice paper gowns to put on that barely closes in the back, and you're sitting on a cold table. That's got to be one of the most vulnerable positions one can be in. And what your hope is that you are entrusting yourself in your most vulnerable state, not only that you're half clothed in this room, but you're ill, you're sick, you're worried, you're concerned. You hope that when you take yourself and put yourself in the hands of this healthcare system or this particular provider, that that provider is going to have your best interest at heart throughout the encounter. That that person will not have any other conflicts of interest that will conflict with their ability to put your needs first. Oh, if that was only true nowadays, that we could count on that 100% of the time. Because the problem is that providers are under a great deal of stress and conflicts. They not only have responsibilities to you as a patient, they may have responsibilities to the managed care company that's going to pay for this visit or that allows them to do this work. They may have teaching responsibilities to other students, residents, interns, medical students, and this is an opportunity to teach. And so they have an obligation to the students as well. They may have research obligations. This patient may be enrolled in a research project. They want to make sure that goes through. So you cannot guarantee, the patient cannot guarantee that their best interest is the only interest in the room at that time. But this is this idea of being able to entrust yourself in that encounter. Now, you may be able to feel confident that you as a patient, that the provider is putting your interest above all others. And many times that can happen. I'm not suggesting that that's never a possibility. But even if they can do that, do they know what they're doing? They being the providers. So this is a whole different category of trust. Can you have confidence